Claire Carter had never been told no. Not once. Not by a board of directors who questioned her decisions, not by rival executives who underestimated her age, not by investors who doubted her vision, and certainly not by any man who had ever stood across from her in a room. She had built an empire before her 35th birthday, turning a modest tech consulting firm into a global conglomerate worth more than $4 billion, and somewhere along the way, she had come to believe, not arrogantly, but simply as a matter of fact, that the world bent in her direction when she walked through it. She was the kind of woman whose name commanded silence when spoken aloud in a boardroom, whose schedule was managed by 3 assistants simultaneously, whose presence at any event shifted the entire gravity of the room. She had learned very early that certainty was a currency, and she had spent it freely and earned it back tenfold. So when she found herself standing in a quiet garden on a warm Tuesday evening, having said words she had never said to any human being before, and the man in front of her simply looked at her with steady, careful eyes, and did not say, yes, Claire Carter did not know, for the first time in as long as she could remember, what to do next. The man's name was William Foster, and he was 38 years old, and he was the least complicated and most difficult person she had ever met. William woke at 5 o'clock every morning without an alarm. He had done it for 7 years, since the autumn, when everything changed. Since the night a phone call from a hospital on the other side of the city had remade the entire architecture of his life in the space of 4 words. His wife, Margaret, had been driving home from a late shift at the dental office, where she worked as a hygienist, when a driver ran a red light on Carpenter Avenue and hit her car on the passenger side. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. Emma was 14 months old. William had sat in the hospital corridor for 2 hours holding his daughter against his chest before anyone thought to bring him a cup of coffee, and he had looked down at the small sleeping face pressed into his shoulder and understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent, that he was all there was now. He had driven home in silence with Emma in the back seat and stood in the kitchen in the dark for a long time before he turned on the light, and then he had begun. 7 years later, the ritual of 5 o'clock was as natural to him as breathing. He moved through the kitchen quietly, setting a pot of water on the stove for oatmeal, slicing half a banana onto a small blue plate that Emma had chosen herself at the grocery store 2 summers ago, because it had a painted turtle on the rim. He packed her lunch while the oatmeal cooked a sandwich cut diagonally because she had once told him triangles tasted better, a small bag of apple slices, a juice box, and a folded note that said something different every day. Sometimes it was a joke. Sometimes just a drawing of a dog, badly rendered, that made her laugh every time. He set the lunchbox by the door and then sat down at the kitchen table with his own coffee and the newspaper, reading for exactly 20 minutes before he went to wake her. The apartment was not large. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that was slightly too small, and a living room that was slightly too cluttered with Emma's art projects, which William could not bring himself to throw away. The walls held her drawings at every height she had ever been able to reach. He worked as a facilities maintenance manager at the Millbrook Commercial Center, overseeing a team of 6 technicians who handled everything from HVAC repairs to elevator certifications to the kind of slow infrastructure problems that most people never noticed until they went wrong. He was good at his job, patient, thorough, and possessed of a mechanical intuition that his supervisor called uncanny. He was not a wealthy man, but he owed nothing to anyone. He had no credit card debt, no gambling habits, no secret vices. He paid his rent on the 1st of every month, kept his truck in good repair, coached Emma's soccer team on Saturday mornings, and brought soup to his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Halloran, when she had her knee replaced in March. The women who worked at the school drop-off line had stopped trying to set him up after the 3rd refusal. A colleague named Dana had introduced him to her cousin at the company Christmas party. And he had been perfectly kind and perfectly uninterested. His sister called every few weeks and reminded him that Margaret would not have wanted him to be alone forever. And he always agreed with her, quietly, and then changed the subject. He was not bitter. He was not broken in any way that was visible. He simply seemed to have made a private arrangement with himself about the boundaries of his life, and within those boundaries he moved with a steadiness that looked from the outside like contentment and felt from the inside like something he had not yet found a name for. One evening, Emma had crawled into his lap while he was reading and looked up at him with her mother's eyes, dark and direct and slightly too old for her face, and asked him if he was ever lonely. He had set down the book and looked at her for a moment. This small person, who was the best thing he had ever done, and he had smiled in the way he did when he meant something completely. Having you, he told her, is more than enough. She had seemed to accept this, pressing her cheek against his arm, and they had sat like that for a while in the yellow kitchen light while the city moved outside the window. But he did not say it was all he needed. He was careful, even with Emma, about the difference between those two things. The rain that Thursday evening came without much warning. By 6 o'clock, the streets of downtown were slicked and dark, and the traffic on the I-4 connector had backed up into surface roads, and the parking lot of the Millbrook Commercial Center, where William was finishing a late walkthrough of the East Wing's ventilation system, was nearly empty. He was crossing toward his truck with his toolbox when he noticed the car stopped at the edge of the lot, hazard lights blinking orange against the wet pavement. It was a car he vaguely recognized as expensive, low, and dark, with the kind of quiet finish that suggested it had not been chosen from a showroom, but specified from a catalog. And the woman standing beside it in a charcoal blazer with her arms crossed was clearly not someone who changed her own. Tears. She was on her phone, and from the rigid set of her shoulders, it was obvious the conversation was not going well. William set down his toolbox and walked over. She looked at him when he approached, and he saw in her expression the brief, instinctive evaluation that people sometimes made when a stranger appeared in a dark parking lot, a rapid calculation of threat and intent, and then it shifted into something more guarded and less readable. "I've called someone," she said, by way of explanation, and also, perhaps, by way of dismissal. "They'll be here in 45 minutes. He looked at the flat tire, which was not complicated. He looked at the spare in the open trunk, which was intact. 45 minutes is a long time in this rain, he said, not unkindly, and picked up the jack. She watched him for a moment, with an expression he couldn't quite identify, and then she got out of his way. He worked in the rain without speaking much. She stood to the side, and at one point he shrugged off his flannel-lined work jacket and held it out to her without looking up from the lug nuts. "You're going to freeze," he said. She hesitated. He could sense the hesitation, even without watching her, and then took it. The jacket was too large and smelled of motor oil, and something warmer underneath, like cedar or old wood, and she put it on without comment. When he had the spare mounted and the flat in the trunk, he stood and wiped his hands on a rag from his toolbox. She was already reaching into her bag, and he shook his head once, simply, without making a performance of it. "No," he said. She stopped. "I don't need the money." She looked at him then with an attention that was different from before, focused, as if she were trying to solve something. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. The question was not arrogant exactly. It was genuine. The kind of question someone asks when they're accustomed to their name, doing a particular kind of work in a room. He considered her for a moment. The rain was easing. Her dark hair was wet at the edges where the jacket's hood had not covered it. And she was looking at him with the direct, measuring eyes of someone who was used to knowing things. "Doesn't matter who you are," he said. "It's cold." He picked up his toolbox, and she stood there in the emptying lot holding his jacket around her shoulders, watching him walk back to his truck, and she did not say anything else. She would think about that sentence for the rest of the week. Her assistant, a meticulous young man named Patrick, found everything she asked for within 6 hours. William Daniel Foster, age 38, facilities maintenance manager at Millbrook Commercial Center. Employed there for 9 years. Widower. One daughter, Emma Rose Foster, age 8, enrolled at Clearwater Elementary, 2nd grade. Rental apartment on Dunmore Street. Truck, 11 years old, registered and insured. No criminal record, no civil suits, no debt collections, no bankruptcies. 3 credit cards, all with 0 outstanding balances. Volunteer soccer coach for the Clearwater Community League. Known by neighbors as quiet, reliable, helpful, known by coworkers as competent, fair, and private. Patrick had handed her the folder with the carefully neutral expression of someone who knows when not to have an opinion. Claire had read it twice, and then set it on the corner of her desk, and looked out the window at the city spread below her. She had expected to find something. People who appeared that uncomplicated usually had a seam somewhere, something running beneath the surface that revealed, under the right pressure, a different shape than the one they showed. She had made her fortune partly by learning to find those seams, but there was nothing in William Foster's file that indicated a seam. He was exactly what he appeared to be. A man who had survived something devastating and built a life from what remained, without bitterness, without performance, without asking anyone to notice. She had been doing business for 15 years in rooms full of men who wanted things from her money, her access, her name, her time, and she had developed a fluency with that particular species of wanting, could sense it in a handshake or a sentence. William Foster had turned down her money in a parking lot in the rain and told her it was cold outside, and he had meant only that it was cold outside. She did not know what to do with that. She found reasons to be in the neighborhood of Clearwater Elementary on a Wednesday morning. She told herself she was inspecting a property 2 blocks east, which was true, and that she happened to be walking past the school at 8:15, which was less accidentally true than it appeared. She saw him from half a block away, the truck she recognized, the easy stride across the sidewalk, the small girl at his side who was wearing a yellow raincoat that was slightly too large and pulling a backpack shaped like a hedgehog. She watched him crouch down to say something to the girl at the gate. He buttoned the top button of her coat, smoothed a section of her hair that had escaped its braid, and then touched her face, just his thumb against her cheek. Briefly, the gesture of someone so accustomed to this particular person that tenderness had become reflexive. The girl said something that made him laugh, and he laughed with his whole face. Not the polished laugh of someone in a meeting, but the laugh of someone who is genuinely and privately delighted. He watched her through the gate until she disappeared into the building. And then he stood, and Claire, half a block away, looked away and felt something move in her chest that she chose not to examine immediately. She had meetings that morning. She went to them. Over the following 2 weeks, she drove past the Millbrook Commercial Center twice at lunch. The second time, she saw him eating a sandwich on a bench outside the east entrance, his work jacket folded beside him, reading something on his phone. He looked the same as he always looked, contained, deliberate, comfortable in his own skin, in the way of someone who had stopped needing to perform himself for other people. She noticed that he gave his remaining chips to a maintenance worker who passed by and sat down next to him, and that they talked for several minutes in an easy way that suggested familiarity and genuine regard. She noticed that he held the door for an older woman with a grocery cart without looking up from whatever he was thinking. She noticed these things, and she felt, uncharacteristically, that she was on the outside of something she could not buy her way into. Claire was not the kind of woman who engineered chance meetings, but she was also not the kind of woman who waited for things to happen to her. She returned to Millbrook the following Thursday, under the pretext of meeting a tenant in the East Wing legitimately, as it happened. She had recently acquired a stake in a retail property nearby, and the meeting was genuine, and she passed William in the corridor near the service elevator at 4:45 in the afternoon. He recognized her immediately, which surprised her slightly. Most people, when they saw her outside the context in which they first encountered her, needed a moment. He simply looked at her with the same steady directness and said, "Your spare holding up all right?" She had laughed, which surprised her too. It was not a laugh she manufactured. He was carrying a work order and a voltage meter, and he looked like he was in the middle of something. But when she asked if he had a few minutes, he said yes. They talked for 20 minutes beside the service elevator, and it was unlike any conversation she had conducted in years. He asked her nothing about her company, her net worth, or her opinion on anything in the news. He asked her what she had been reading lately, which nobody had asked her in so long she had to think about it. She told him about a book on urban planning she had been working through for a month, and he asked a question about it that was specific and genuinely curious. She found herself explaining the book to him with more enthusiasm than she had realized she had for the subject, and he listened in the particular way of someone who is actually tracking what you're saying and not preparing their response while you speak. When his radio crackled with something urgent and he excused himself, she watched him walk away down the corridor and stood there for a moment, in the flickering fluorescent light feeling, obscurely, like she had just remembered something she had forgotten she knew. She asked him, the next time, if he and his daughter would like to join her for lunch on Saturday. She phrased it simply, without ceremony. The way she had noticed, he communicated. He said he would ask Emma. The answer, relayed through a text message the following morning, was yes. Emma apparently had opinions about ice cream that were non-negotiable, and any Saturday plan would need to accommodate this. Claire said that was not a problem. It was, in fact, the most reasonable condition she had encountered in a business negotiation in years. Emma Foster was 8 years old and possessed of a specific, unhurried confidence that Claire had not expected. She was small for her age, with her father's steady brown eyes and a gap between her two front teeth that appeared when she smiled, which was often. She shook Claire's hand when they met outside the ice cream shop on Hartley Street with the gravity of someone concluding a formal agreement, and then she explained, without any particular preamble, that she only liked vanilla, but that she would never tell anyone who liked other flavors that they were wrong, because her dad had told her that taste was subjective and that judging people for it was bad manners. Claire agreed that this was an excellent policy. Emma considered her for a moment with those careful eyes and then said, "You have really straight teeth." Claire told her she had worn braces for 2 years in middle school. Emma said, "My mom was a teeth person." She said it simply, without pain in it, the way children sometimes carry enormous things not because the things aren't heavy, but because they've been helped to carry them so long that their arms have learned the weight. William, across the table, had watched this exchange with an expression that was still but not empty, the expression of someone paying close and private attention to something they care about enormously. Claire caught his eye for a second over Emma's head, and he gave a small nod that she understood to mean, "She's okay. She talks about Margaret sometimes. Don't be uncomfortable." She wasn't uncomfortable. She was, without entirely planning for it, moved. They spent the rest of the afternoon at the park 2 blocks over, where Emma had a system for the swings that she explained at length. You had to pump exactly 6 times to get to the height where you could see the top of the pharmacy sign on the corner, and if you jumped from that height, the landing spot was specifically the patch of bark between the 2 roots, and where William pushed her until his face was warm, and the late afternoon light made the whole park look like something out of a memory. Claire sat on the bench and watched them and thought about nothing for 20 minutes, which was something she had not done in longer than she could name. On the walk back to the parking lot, Emma slipped her hand into Claire's without comment, as if this were an ordinary thing, and Claire felt the small, warm weight of it and did not say anything, only walked. That night, back in her penthouse apartment, with its clean geometric lines and view of the city that she had never once found comforting, she sat at her kitchen island with a glass of wine and thought about a gap-toothed girl who thought taste was subjective, and a man who pushed swings with his whole body and brought soup to old women after knee surgery. She thought about what it felt like to sit on a park bench and think about nothing. She thought about how many years it had been since she had wanted something she couldn't put in a contract. She found more reasons to see them. William did not seek her out, which she had come to expect, but he did not turn her away either. He accepted her presence in his life with the same calm deliberateness with which he seemed to accept everything, not passively, not as a man who was flattered into compliance, but as a man who had decided, after whatever private consideration he gave to things, that she was worth his time. This distinction, she understood, mattered enormously. He had decided. She felt the difference between being pursued and being chosen, and discovered that only one of them meant anything. They had dinner together, she, William, and Emma, at a diner near his apartment that Emma called her favorite place in the world. Primarily because the waitress there, a woman named Gloria, knew Emma's order by heart and always brought her a small cup of whipped cream on the side, without being asked. They attended Emma's school fair in October, where Claire discovered she was extremely bad at ring toss and extremely good at the cakewalk, and where William bought a jar of homemade peach jam from a second grader's fundraiser table and carried it in his jacket pocket for the rest of the afternoon with total unself-consciousness. They went on a Sunday picnic at the reservoir south of the city, where Emma fell asleep in the grass after lunch with her head on William's jacket, and the two adults sat on either side of her in the late October sun and talked quietly about things that had nothing to do with business or power, or the version of themselves they showed the rest of the world. William told her about Margaret in the way people sometimes talk about the dead when they've had enough time and enough trust with love that was still present but no longer flinching. He told her what Margaret had laughed at, what she'd been reading the week she died, how she had been the kind of person who remembered every birthday but always forgot where she put her keys. Claire listened without filling the silences, which was something she had been deliberately learning. She told him, in exchange, about her mother, who had worked 2 jobs and saved for 12 years to send her to a state university, and who had cried at her graduation not because she was proud but because she was finally allowed to rest. William listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and when she finished, he said, simply, "She sounds like someone who understood what things cost." Claire had to look away for a moment at the water. One night in November, she was working late in her office. She almost always was. The habit as deep-seated as William's 5 o'clock alarm, when her phone showed a notification from the video call app she had installed 3 weeks ago at Emma's request, so that they could show each other drawings. The notification was from William. She answered it, and it was Emma, in her pajamas, holding up a drawing of a horse she had made that afternoon, explaining in great detail that horses were actually much harder to draw than dogs because of the legs. William was visible in the background, washing dishes, and he looked up once and smiled briefly in Claire's direction before returning to the task. Claire realized, sitting in her enormous office with the city glittering 30 floors below her, and a drawing of a difficult horse filling her phone screen, that she was happier in this moment than she had been in any meeting, any closing, any triumph she had accumulated in 15 years of relentless work. She was not good at being happy in that uncomplicated way. She was going to have to practice. She began to notice William's expressions when he didn't know she was watching. The way he held his coffee cup with both hands when he was thinking. The way he read the work order on his clipboard with his lips pressed together very slightly. Not a frown, but a form of concentration. The way he looked at Emma not with the performed delight of a parent in public, but with something quieter and more permanent, like looking at a fixed star. One night in late November, Emma ran a fever of 102, and Claire, who happened to be dropping something off, and found the house dim and the girl flushed and miserable on the couch, stayed without being asked. She sat with Emma while William managed the thermometer and the children's medicine, and the cool cloth for her forehead, moving through the small apartment with the focused calm of someone who had done this before and knew exactly which cabinet held what. It was 1 in the morning before Emma's temperature broke and she finally slept. William sat back against the couch cushions and closed his eyes for a moment, not dramatically, just the way someone closes their eyes when they can finally let themselves be tired. Claire, sitting on the other end of the couch with Emma's feet in her lap, looked at his face in the low lamplight, the lines around his mouth that were deeper than they should be for his age, the exhaustion that was also, unmistakably, love, and she knew something she had been circling for months. It settled in her without ceremony. She knew. The story found its way out, as stories always do, through the peculiar gravity of gossip and money. A photograph appeared taken, apparently, outside the Clearwater School fair by someone with a phone and a connection to a news aggregator of Claire Carter, in a denim jacket beside a man carrying a jar of peach jam and a child in a Halloween costume. The photograph was, objectively, unremarkable. The story that attached itself to it was not. By Monday, it had been seen by nearly every person in Claire's professional orbit. By Tuesday, the calls had begun. Marcus Holt, who chaired the board of directors of Carter Global, called at 7 in the morning. She let it go to voicemail and listened to it at 8, while she drank her coffee and looked at the city. He was tactful, as he always was. But the substance of what he said was what it always was when money was involved. Perception matters. Optics are a currency. The wrong association at the wrong moment could compromise investor confidence. She heard, underneath the carefully chosen words, the older and less careful word, unworthy. Her college friend Diana called from her house in the Hamptons and suggested, in the voice she used when she was trying to be gentle and was instead being condescending, that Claire was going through some kind of phase, that the pressures of running a company at her level could produce certain emotional responses that felt like clarity but were actually, and here Diana had used the word infatuation with the tender certainty of someone who had never been told they were wrong. A business reporter wrote a piece that asked, in its headline, "What a woman worth $4 billion could possibly want with a maintenance worker?" Claire read the piece once and then forwarded it to her lawyer without comment. She was in the board meeting on Wednesday afternoon, sitting at the head of the long glass table, when Marcus brought it up directly. He was not unkind. He was worse than unkind. He was reasonable. He spoke of the public interest in her personal life, of the ways in which associations, however innocent, had derailed corporate governance before. He spoke of William Foster, in the language of accounting, what he had, what he lacked, what the arithmetic of their difference implied. She let him finish. She had learned, over 15 years, that letting people finish was a form of power, because it meant you had heard everything they had, and you were still standing. She set down her pen. "What you're describing," she said, "is a man with no debt, no criminal record, no known vices, a strong employment history, and a daughter who is kind to strangers." She paused. "You're describing these as risks." The room was quiet. "The man I'm worried about," she said, "is someone who measures other people's worth by their bank balance. I've been in a lot of rooms with men like that." She looked at Marcus with a directness that he had learned over 8 years to treat carefully. Not a single one of them has ever brought soup to a sick neighbor. She picked up her pen again. She moved on to the next agenda item. The subject was not raised again that afternoon. Outside the office, the noise continued for several weeks. She had learned to tune out noise. What she could not tune out was William. She had thought about it for a long time. That was not her usual method. She was typically decisive, moving from assessment to action with the speed of someone who trusted her own judgment. Absolutely. But this was different. The things that mattered here were not the things she was trained to evaluate. She could not model the risk in a spreadsheet. She could not run a due diligence report on whether her own heart was telling her the truth. She thought about it on airplanes, and in the back of cars, and in the silent kitchen of her apartment at night. And she came to the same place every time. That she had not been this certain of anything in years, and that she was terrified, and that the terror felt, unexpectedly, like proof. She took William to the garden of the Hartwell estate on the last Tuesday of November, a private property she had acquired 2 years ago, with the intention of converting it, a project that had been delayed, leaving the garden in a kind of deliberate wilderness that she had come to find beautiful. The late light came in low and golden through the old oaks. The air smelled of wet earth and the last of the autumn leaves. She had not told him why they were coming, and he had not asked, which was a thing she had come to rely on the way he trusted her enough to follow without needing the destination explained in advance. They walked through the garden for a while, not saying very much, and then she stopped in a clearing where the light came through the branches in a way that looked like something intentional, something arranged. Though she knew it was only physics and chance, she turned to face him. She told him what she wanted to tell him. She had rehearsed it and then abandoned the rehearsal, because the practiced version had sounded like a presentation, and this was not a presentation. She told him that she had not known what was missing from her life until she met him, and that she understood now that what had been missing was not someone powerful or successful or socially compatible, but someone real, someone who showed up the same way in every room, someone who had looked at her in a rainy parking lot and seen a person who was cold and nothing more. She told him she loved him, and she told him she loved Emma, and then she did what she had never done in a boardroom or a negotiation or any moment in 15 years of building a world. She got down on one knee. She looked up at him and she said, "William Foster, will you marry me?" The garden was very quiet. A bird moved somewhere in the oak branches above them. The late November light held them both in its long, golden angle, and William looked down at her, this woman who had appeared in his parking lot in the rain, and who had eaten peach jam at a school fair, and who had sat at 1 in the morning on his couch with his daughter's feet in her lap and not moved until the fever broke, and he did not say yes. He reached down and took her hands and gently brought her to her feet. He held her hands in both of his, and he looked at her for a long moment with the full, steady attention that was the most characteristic thing about him. And then he said, "Claire," just her name first. "You are an extraordinary woman." She felt the but before it arrived. "But I can't say yes. Not yet. Not like this." She opened her mouth and he shook his head very slightly. "I'll only get married for one reason," he said. "Because it's love. Real love. Not because you're lonely, and I think you've been lonely for a long time, and I understand that. Not because you're grateful. Not because you want to save each other from something. Those things feel like love, sometimes. They're not the same thing." He paused. "And Emma." He said her name the way he always said it, like it contained something irreplaceable. "If you're going to be in her life, it can't be a decision. It can't be something you choose because you chose me. She's already lost one person. She can't lose someone again because they were never really sure." Claire's eyes had filled. She was not someone who cried easily, and she was crying, and she did not look away from him. "I'm not saying no," he said. His voice was the same quiet, deliberate, entirely his own. "I'm saying, not yet. Show me. Not me, I can see you. Show Emma. Show yourself." He let go of her hands. She stood in the clearing with the tears on her face and the last of the afternoon light around her, and she understood that she had just been told the truest thing anyone had said to her in years, and that it had cost him something to say it, and that she would have to earn what she wanted, and that this was entirely fair. She did not bring up marriage again. She did not make a plan. She simply continued. Which was, she was beginning to understand, the whole of what he had asked. She showed up at Emma's school play in December, and sat in the 3rd row, and watched a child in a cardboard crown recite 2 lines about the winter solstice with tremendous seriousness, and afterward she told Emma that she had been the most commanding presence on the stage, which was not untrue, and also made Emma straighten her spine by approximately an inch. She learned to make pasta from scratch, not from a chef, not from a class, but from a YouTube tutorial and a borrowed pasta machine, and several failed attempts in her own kitchen, which she documented in photographs she sent to William, who sent back a photograph of Emma laughing at the worst one. She sat with Emma on Sunday afternoons while William worked on the truck in the parking lot below the apartment window. The two of them spread across the living room floor with markers and paper, making maps of imaginary countries. Emma's countries always had very specific laws. Citizens were required to own a pet. Mondays were optional. Ice cream was, constitutionally, free. In January, the company sent her to London and then to Milan to address a crisis with a European subsidiary that had been mismanaged by a regional director and needed restructuring. She was gone for 6 weeks. It would have been easy, she thought on the plane somewhere over the Atlantic, with a glass of water and a folder of financials and the dark ocean below, to let the distance do what distance sometimes does, to allow the practical complications of 2 lives so structurally different from each other to make the decision for her. She could have not called. She could have allowed the 6 weeks to become a kind of unconscious answer. Instead, she called Emma every Wednesday and Friday evening, accounting for the time difference, and she showed her the inside of hotel lobbies and the view from her office window overlooking the Thames, and a picture of a pigeon that had walked across her meeting table, and Emma showed her drawings and told her about school, and reported on the status of a drama between 2 classmates that had been ongoing since October, with the seriousness of someone briefing a foreign correspondent. On the 5th Wednesday, Emma had been quieter than usual, and Claire had asked what was wrong, and Emma had looked at the camera for a moment, and then said, "I miss you, Mama Claire." She said it quietly, the same way she said all important things. Claire had pressed her lips together and breathed carefully and said, "I miss you too, sweetheart. I'll be home soon." She hung up the phone and sat for a long time in her London hotel room, looking at nothing. And what she was feeling was not complicated. It was simple in the way that only the most important things are simple. William, when she told him what Emma had said, was quiet for a moment. He was standing in the kitchen, making coffee, and he was quiet for several seconds. And then he looked at the mug in his hand, and then he looked at the family photograph on the refrigerator, Margaret and himself and Emma at the beach, Emma in a sun hat, Margaret laughing at something off camera, and he held the mug in both hands for a long moment in the way he did when he was working something through. He did not say anything specific. But something in the quality of his silence had shifted, and Claire, who had become fluent in his silences, understood that he was no longer waiting. She did not expect it. She thought she had learned to expect things less, that William's influence on her had extended to this, to living in the present tense, rather than projecting forward along probability curves, but she had not expected this. They were at Riverside Park on a Saturday afternoon in early spring, the three of them, the same park where they had gone the first afternoon, that Emma had taken her hand on the walk back to the car. Emma was at the swings. The light was the particular clean light of early April, the sky awash in certain blue, and the grass had just come back to itself after the winter. William had been quieter than usual all afternoon, which was not dramatic. He was always quiet, but there was something in the quality of it that made Claire pay attention. He had been carrying something in his jacket pocket, she had noticed, something small that made him reach for the pocket and then stop twice. She had not asked. She had waited. He said her name. She turned to look at him. He was already down on one knee, and he looked up at her with the same steady, careful eyes she had first seen in a wet parking lot more than a year ago, and he said, "There's something I should have said a long time ago, but I needed to be sure not of you. I was sure of you. I needed to be sure of me." He opened a small box. The ring inside was not elaborate. It was silver, simple, with a single stone that caught the April light. "Emma and I talked about this," he said. "She helped me pick it." His voice was even and quiet, the same voice he always used. And it was more beautiful to her than any speech she had ever been given. "Last November you asked me a question and I couldn't answer it yet. I've been carrying the answer for a while now, and I think it's time I gave it to you." He looked at her directly. "I love you, Claire, not the version of you that runs the company or manages the board or knows how to make every room pay attention. You, the one who watches Emma sleep and worries about whether she's eating enough vegetables, and called her every Wednesday from London because you knew she needed to hear your voice." He paused. "Emma loves you, and this small family of mine, we need you in it." He took a breath. "Will you marry us?" Behind him, at the swings, Emma had stopped pumping and was watching with her gap-toothed smile so wide it seemed too large for her face. And she was also, unmistakably, about to cry, and trying not to, which was the most William thing she had ever done. Claire looked from him to her and back to him, and she said yes. She said it without hesitation and without performance, which was not how she said most things. And it felt like the most natural sentence she had ever constructed. He stood and put the ring on her hand, and she held his face and kissed him, and Emma came off the swings at a run, and hit both of them at approximately the same moment, with the force of an 8-year-old who had been waiting for this conclusion, for as long as she had understood that it was a possibility. They stood there in the April light, the three of them tangled together in the middle of the park, and William had both arms around both of them, and his eyes were closed, and his face was the face of a man who has everything he needs. They were married in June, on a Saturday afternoon, in the garden of the Hartwell estate, the same garden where Claire had knelt in the November light. It was not a grand wedding. Claire could have made it a grand wedding. She could have filled that garden with photographers and caterers, and the kind of guests who attend events because being seen at them is a form of currency. She did not. There were 41 people in attendance, her mother, who arrived in the dress she had been saving since Claire finished her MBA, and who cried so steadily and quietly throughout the ceremony that William's sister pressed a stack of tissues into her hand and held it there for 20 minutes. His sister, her husband, their 3 children, Mrs. Halloran from next door, delivered by a car Claire had arranged, sitting in a garden chair with her cane and her good dress and an expression of deep personal satisfaction. Emma's second-grade teacher, who had known her since the September she had arrived in class with careful eyes and a hedgehog backpack. William's co-workers, the 6 of them, all in their good shirts, clustered near the garden wall. Patrick, who had found the original folder on William Foster 11 months ago and had been watching this story proceed, with the expression of someone who does not entirely admit to themselves that they are invested in the outcome. Diana from the Hamptons, who had called it a phase and who was now weeping openly at the back. Which was not something Claire pointed out, because she was, at her core, more generous than she was vindicated. Emma stood between them during the ceremony in a yellow dress that she had chosen herself, and white shoes that she had already scuffed on the garden path, her hair braided back with small white flowers that Claire had put there that morning in the bathroom of the estate, both of them reflected in the mirror. Emma watching Claire's hands in the particular way she had of observing things she wanted to learn. The officiant was a judge who had gone to college with Claire's mother, a small, serious woman who read the vows with care and asked them to speak their own words after. William's words were few, and they were all true. Claire's were longer and also all true, and she said them without notes, which was unusual for her in a public setting, and which meant she meant every one of them. When it was done and they were married, Emma looked up at both of them with the full gravity of the occasion and then said, at a volume she had perhaps not intended to be quite as carrying as it was, "Now I have a mom." And then, slightly quieter, with the gap-toothed smile, "Can we have cake now?" The laughter that came from 41 people simultaneously in a garden on a June afternoon was the sound that William Foster would recall, in years to come, when anyone asked him what the best day of his life had felt like. He would not describe the light, or the flowers, or the ring on Claire's hand, or the look on the judge's face, trying to maintain decorum. He would describe the laughter and the way Emma had stood between them afterward, with one hand in each of theirs, and looked up at the sky, with the expression of someone who has settled, conclusively, a question that has been open for a long time. In the months and years that followed, Claire did not stop working. She was not, fundamentally, a woman who stopped working, and William had never asked her to be. What changed was not the scale of what she did, but the reason she did it, which turned out to change everything else. She worked because she was good at it, and because it mattered, and because her mother had sacrificed too much for her to waste the gift of her own capability. But she came home at night, now, to a kitchen where William was cooking, and Emma was doing homework at the table, and the apartment on Dunmore Street had been expanded into the unit next door and smelled of something warm. She came home to this. And the word home meant something it had not meant for as long as she could honestly remember. What Claire Carter had built over 15 years was considerable. She had built it from intelligence and determination, and a willingness to outwork every person in every room she had ever entered. She had built it at a cost she had not always acknowledged, and in ways that had left certain rooms in her life very quiet and very empty for a very long time. What she had not been able to build, in 15 years of building, was the thing she had found in a parking lot in the rain, and a diner near Dunmore Street, and a park where an 8-year-old explained the aerodynamics of the optimal swing jump. She had not been able to build it because it was not the kind of thing that gets built by one person. It gets built the way families get built, out of choice and persistence, and the accumulated weight of ordinary moments, and the willingness to show up again and again, not because the contract requires it, but because the people require it. Because you have become the kind of person who cannot imagine not showing up, because somewhere along the way, the choice became something more permanent than choice. William had known this already, in the way he knew most important things, not by reasoning his way to it, but by having lived it. By having stood in a dark kitchen 7 years ago, and turned on the light and begun. He had tried to tell her this in a November garden, and she had been smart enough and honest enough to hear him. Emma, for her part, had known it longest of all. Children often do. They know who stays.